Hey everyone, I'm the Casual Console Gamer, and I have another review. This time, it's Final Fantasy XVI on the PlayStation 5. As always, here's the Too Long Didn't Watch, where I give you an overview of my thoughts and opinions on the game. Final Fantasy XVI suffers from an identity crisis. It's clear that the developers wanted to take the series in a completely different direction from its JRPG roots. Everything from the simplified combat, the minimal RPG elements, and the darker story is such a contrast from the previous entries. But I wish they hadn't ignored or discarded the things that made the Final Fantasy series so great in the first place. Overall, the story is good, but has some serious pacing issues. Its sky highs are followed by subterranean lows, creating a game that is filled with peaks and valleys. To make matters worse, Final Fantasy XVI has an MMO-style side quest system, so be prepared for a majority of them to be fast travel to this location, and kill the enemies to collect items or pick up materials to bring back to base. Final Fantasy XVI's epic moments really stand out and will stick with you after the credits roll, but they do suffer from diminishing returns as you experience similar combat encounters and story beats again and again. There's a lot to like in this game, but there are also a lot of flaws. In general, I feel Final Fantasy XVI would have been an incredible 20 to 25 hour game that is stretched to fill 40 or even 50 hours. If you're a fan of the series, the changes to combat and the lack of RPG elements may turn you off. But if you are a newcomer that disliked JRPGs, this may be the game for you.
Wait. Something's not right.
For this review, I thought I would do something a little different than my previous videos. Instead of breaking the game down into different sections and categories, I thought I would instead list things that I liked and didn't like about Final Fantasy XVI. So first off, I absolutely love the music in this game. I listen to a lot of soundtracks and music without vocals while I write, which means I have music playing in the background for long stretches every day. I have a few soundtracks that I return to, and after playing Final Fantasy XVI, I now have some new tracks to add to that playlist. Familiar favorites make a return, while there are a lot of new songs that feature a relaxing acoustic guitar while you're in the hideout, or bombastic rock or techno music while you're fighting a boss. I will say that there were a few odd choices during some of the climactic battles that did seem out of place, but overall, it's a fantastic soundtrack. To add on to the music, the voice actors and cast of this game are amongst the best I have heard. Ben Starr, the voice of Clive, carries this entire game on his shoulders, since he's the only character you get to play as in Final Fantasy XVI, and he doesn't disappoint. The characters are really well developed, each with their own personalities and traits, and I found myself caring about them so much over the course of the game. I did find it funny that some of the models of the characters sometimes didn't match what I thought the voice actor would look like. For example, Cid sounds like a 60-year-old man who drinks and smokes a lot, but his on-screen character is like a supermodel. It's just a small comment about something that I noticed. It doesn't detract from the game at all. But they do a fantastic job, especially from a JRPG that can have really hit or miss English voice acting. For a game as story-heavy as this one, there's so much of the best moments that rely on Clive or one of his companions nailing a scene, and it was very much appreciated the effort they put into it.
The blight sucked this place dry, meaning no trees, no birds, and no magic. But it also means no neighbors.
The last place anyone would think to look.
I love the lore of Final Fantasy XVI. Each game in the series insists on new characters and worlds, and the team behind 16 crafted such an interesting realm. It was clear they were inspired by Game of Thrones, while retaining the strange and sometimes outrageous things we associate with the Final Fantasy series. 16 takes place on Valisthea, a world where magic comes from the use of crystals, or to those born with the innate ability to use it. There are multiple countries that scheme or sometimes outright war against each other. To add to the mix, there are things called icons, powerful godlike beings that inhabit the bodies of people called dominants, allowing them to use magic and call on their abilities. Think of icons like nuclear weapons, where mutual assured destruction keeps a tentative peace or prevents all-out war from happening across the planet. Further complicating things is the fact that those born with the ability to use magic, called bearers, are essentially treated like slaves, and the use of their magic eventually kills them. Alright, so like I said, I love the lore of Final Fantasy XVI. It helps that there's a codex in your hideout that explains all the concepts, otherwise I would have been completely lost. There's also an active lore codex option that you can access at any time that gives you information about people, places, or concepts currently on the screen. Different from the lore, we have the story. I'm going to be very vague about the story in order to avoid spoilers. All the clips I'm using in this video are from the first few hours of the game. You play as Clive, who is on a quest to destroy large, magical crystals called the Mother Crystals. Seriously, I don't want to spoil much of the story, so I don't really want to get into it too much. I will say that the story has major pacing problems, and that's something I didn't like. There are multiple epic fights that are followed by lulls that make me wonder what they were thinking when they designed them. If I had to compare it to something, it would be like the Avengers movie. If you aren't familiar, in the Avengers movie, the entire film builds up to this climactic fight that will be memorable to anyone who watched it. There's a scene after the credits where the heroes are gathered in a restaurant eating shawarma, and it's the most mundane thing imaginable. That's what made it so great and funny, the juxtaposition between fighting a horde of aliens and boring tasks like eating out as a group. Now take Final Fantasy XVI. It has multiple times throughout the story where it does this. Imagine you're fighting this epic battle against an enemy, and it's a cinematic masterpiece. Then, right after, you have to go help a merchant deliver his goods or pick some flowers from a field. That's Final Fantasy XVI's story in a nutshell. Epic moments followed by mundanity. It gets worse, and those epic moments keep repeating throughout the story, making them decidedly less epic each time it happens. I found that Final Fantasy XVI's story is a tale of diminishing returns. I like the story, but it would have been better if they cut large chunks of it out and streamlined it significantly. It took me 40 hours to beat Final Fantasy XVI, and that's with me doing half of the side content. It would have been much better if the story were, say, 20 or 25 hours without that filler and those boring lows. The developers could have spent that extra time just improving the side quests. Which brings me to my next point. I hated the side quests. I think they were made worse by just how great some of the moments in the main storyline were, when you contrast them to the terrible side content. Think of an MMO or other RPG. Usually at the very start of the game, you do silly things like collect herbs or hunt small beasts for the early quests. Like a Dragon Quest game has you hunting slimes, or Diablo 2 has you killing slow-moving undead. Final Fantasy XVI has you doing some of those things throughout it. It'll say, hey, go kill that dragon. Oh, by the way, we also need some flowers for the infirmary first, so fast travel across the map and then pick them for me. In return, here's some crafting materials you don't need because you have thousands of them in your inventory already, or a few gil, even though you have more than enough money to buy whatever's available in the shop. The side content is just pretty much pointless, and aside from a bit of character building for people who aren't given much screen time, for the most part, it's not worth doing.
She's the best healer this side of the belt. You've nothing to worry about. Go on, have a look around. I'll be in my solar.
I don't like that they removed most of the RPG elements from Final Fantasy XVI in order to appeal to a bigger audience. I felt like it was a poor thing to do since most of the people playing this game would have been fans of the series already. I don't think removing a lot of the things that make a series like Final Fantasy unique would broaden its appeal. Instead, you're more likely to alienate your existing fans rather than draw in new ones, but that's just my opinion. So what are the RPG elements in Final Fantasy XVI like? Well, they're as bare bones as they come, to the point where they might as well not have existed in the first place. They really feel like they were an afterthought after somebody complained during testing or something that it just didn't feel like a Final Fantasy game without RPG. Clive can level up, although stats don't really do much since all the enemies keep a consistent pace with you as you move throughout the world. They don't scale, but some of the areas, they just match you. So if you're level 10, you're usually going to go to an area with level 10 enemies, just like you would do at level 20 and 30 and 40. So you never really need to worry about if you're underleveled or need to grind at all. Gear options have been significantly reduced compared to previous entries in the series. You have a sword, a belt, and bracers. The sword has both a damage stat and a stagger stat, while the belt and bracers have defense and health. You can purchase new gear at set points in the story from vendors, or craft them from the blacksmith using materials you find in the world. Certain equipment can be enhanced as well, giving them minor stat boosts. And when I mean minor, I mean very minor. a couple points of health more when you already have thousands of them kind of thing. The sword damage is the only stat that I saw that was significantly changed for new items. But even then, you're looking at a difference of 5 or 10 attack when you switch items. And how much does that really change the damage you do in combat? I never really do. Never really notice a difference. So look, you can ignore the equipment in Final Fantasy 16 and do just fine. Just equip items with bigger numbers when you find them, or just check in with the merchant periodically and you'll be all set. There are also accessories to equip in 3 different slots. They just mostly give percentage upgrade damage to certain abilities. That's it. Like I said, it's really just an afterthought. But what about magic? That's like a series staple in Final Fantasy. Well, that's gone. There's no real magic to use. Instead, you have abilities with cooldowns, and you have to spend ability points you get from quests to upgrade. Each icon gives Clive a different set of abilities to use, but again, don't worry about it too much. You can use basic magic attacks that are very weak compared to your sword attacks, so there's no point in using them. There isn't anything like enemies having immunities to certain elements or breaking guards with certain kinds of attacks. Just find a set of abilities you like to use and spam the hell out of them as they come down off cooldown. Never worry about the need to change abilities to suit the situation you're in. And this brings me to my next point. I didn't like the combat in Final Fantasy 16. I kind of liked it at first for the first few hours of the game, but as it went on, I went from liking it to just tolerating it to outright loathing and dreading every encounter. Combat always, and I mean always, works the same way. You mash the attack button, using dodge before you are hit by an attack, and then you spam your abilities as soon as they are off cooldown. Getting new abilities from icons should switch things up, but the formula is always the same. I will admit, I did love the perfect dodge mechanic because it looks and feels really cool. Clive would just teleport away from danger and you can get a few hits in return. But enemies are really spongy, and every encounter has a few bigger enemies or mini bosses with a stagger mechanic that just makes it a slog. Worse, if the enemy is large, like a dragon, or if they're flying, it can be hard to hit them, even with the teleport ability Clive has. Obviously, its combat is inspired by Devil May Cry because it's the same people who designed that game. If you aren't feeling the combat right from the start, if it doesn't click with you right away, just don't expect it to change. You may get more abilities and options in combat, but the fundamentals always stay the same.
It's beautiful.
The heart of Sanbreque.
So, if combat isn't great, then the rest of the game must make up for it, right? Well, aside from combat, there really is only cinematics or just talking to people. That's pretty much it. Final Fantasy 16 mostly consists of the following. There's a long cinematic, a short corridor with combat encounters separated by either doors or gaps to crawl through or things to climb. After a few of those, there's another cutscene and then you fight the boss. After the boss fight and you watch that next cutscene, you return to your hideout where you have many conversations with people and either do side quests that aren't really memorable or enjoyable, or you just push on to the main quest. The problem with the main quest structure is that many of them feel like side content. There's large action set pieces, but then they're separated by these mundane activities that you just have to do to progress the game. It's so strange to be on this epic quest with world-shaking stakes and being forced to stop and collect sand and materials from across the map when you just fought an entire army and a dragon to boot. One part of the game has you chasing after a kid who pickpocketed you. This is in the main campaign when you're really on your way to save the world. It's really odd. Final Fantasy 16 has a ton of cinematics, to the point where it feels like I'm watching a show rather than a game. And for the record, I don't count QuickTime events as gameplay. It felt like I was watching a Netflix miniseries on Final Fantasy with small snippets of combat for large portions of the game. So if you're the type of player who doesn't like cutscenes or dialogue and you just want to skip all that boring stuff to play the game, Final Fantasy 16 is not for you. For the record, the cinematics are beautiful. The game looks incredible. But there's that whole diminishing return thing I talked about earlier. The first couple of times you see something beautiful or epic or amazing, it's this memorable experience. But after a half dozen or a dozen times of having the control ripped away from you so that something happens on screen and you're just sitting there watching, it does get tiresome. All right, there's something else I don't like, and it's kind of hard to talk about without spoilers, but I'm going to try. There are a lot of story threads in Final Fantasy XVI. For example, there's bearers being treated like slaves, or the intrigue between nations like a Game of Thrones. Unfortunately, a lot of these story threads get cast aside and are left unresolved throughout the game. For the first half, Final Fantasy XVI is this very dark and gritty, mature entry into the series that Final Fantasy just never really had in the past entries. There's a lot of build-up in how these countries and kingdoms interact with each other, and how they're always plotting and scheming and backstabbing. Then we have these bearers who are either treated as second-class citizens at best, or slaves or objects to just be cast aside when they're useless. Their lives are hard, and they die in such massive numbers that it's really heartbreaking. But at some point in the game, roughly around the halfway mark, there is a definite shift in the narrative. Final Fantasy XVI goes from like a Game of Thrones, Spartacus story to, as the only way I can really describe it is Godzilla, Dragon Ball Z. You have Godzilla type monsters going Super Saiyan, powering up and hurling Kamehamehas and other attacks at each other. And all that intrigue and gritty realism and Game of Throniness gets thrown at the window, and Final Fantasy XVI pivots really hard. It's not as bad as Final Fantasy XV, where you have the beginning of the game is this open world adventure between 4 friends, and then it shifts like a Frankenstein's monster stitched together where it completely changes and you know things are missing. It's just the tone shifts really bad in Final Fantasy XVI. It's hard to describe without watching it yourself, but you'll definitely know when it gets really zany, whereas the beginning sections are this grounded in this realism, well, as much as a fantasy game can be. I could go on and on about the different things I liked and didn't like about Final Fantasy XVI, but overall, it is a good game that made some decisions regarding gameplay and story pacing that I just didn't like personally. Would I play it again even years down the road? Probably not. To me, this is one of those one and done type games. I would have a problem recommending Final Fantasy XVI to people who are fans of Final Fantasy, since it's such a departure from others in the series. Conversely, it's a quote-unquote weird kind of game, and I would have difficulty recommending it to people who aren't fans of Final Fantasy as well, especially when things shift into that full JRPG strangeness. My suggestion is take a look at the gameplay and try it out for yourself. Make your own opinion based on what you're seeing and how you feel about it. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate all the subscribers and the comments you guys leave. Make sure to subscribe and like this video. It really motivates me to put out more.